The rhythmic, wet slap of the mop against the linoleum was the only heartbeat the hallway had at 5 in the morning. For Master Sergeant Elijah, Eli Christopher, the sound was a meditation. He moved with a precision that the young men in the barracks would never understand, a methodical, overlapping pattern that ensured not a single square inch of the floor was left untouched. Eli didn't mind the blue jumpsuit. It was clean, it was functional, and it was a shield. For 40 years, his identity had been etched into the brass and silver pinned to a chest that now felt a little heavier than it used to. Now, the only thing he carried was a wooden handle and a galvanized steel bucket that rattled softly as he rolled it down the corridor of the Marine Corps Logistics Base. He was the first soul awake, a ghost in the machine of the military-industrial complex. He saw the base in a way the commanders never did. He saw the cigarette butts tucked into corner moldings, the coffee rings on the mahogany desks of men who forgot that someone had to wipe them away, and the scuff marks left by the aggressive heels of boots belonging to boys who hadn't yet learned how to walk with purpose. By 0700, the silence died. The base began to hum with the energy of 1,000 young lungs and the thud of synchronized footsteps. Eli pulled his cart to the side of the main thoroughfare, an island of denim in a sea of digital camouflage. "Hey Pops, watch the boots, I just shined these." The voice belonged to Private Tyler Brooks. He was 19, with a high-end tight haircut that looked like it had been carved out of granite and an ego that hadn't yet been tempered by a day of actual combat. He didn't look at Eli's face, he looked at the bucket. To Brooks, Eli wasn't a man, he was a maintenance requirement. Eli didn't respond. He simply tightened his grip on the mop handle, his knuckles scarred and thick, and stepped back an inch to give the squad more room. His posture remained straight, not the rigid, artificial straightness of a recruit trying to impress a drill instructor, but the natural, effortless carriage of a man who had spent decades carrying a ruck through the mountains of Tora Bora. "Does he even speak?" Another voice snickered. That was Miller, a kid with a smirk that was destined to get him into trouble. "He looks like he's been here since the halls of Montezuma. Probably remembers when they used muskets." The squad erupted in a chorus of jagged laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. They passed him in a blur of olive drab and arrogance, the wind of their movement tugging at the fabric of Eli's jumpsuit. One of them intentionally stepped onto the wet patch Eli had just finished cleaning, leaving a muddy, treaded print in the center of the pristine floor. Eli looked down at the mark. He didn't sigh. He didn't feel the heat of anger rise in his chest. He had seen the eyes of men who had stared into the abyss, and he had looked back. The mockery of children was nothing more than the buzzing of flies. He waited until the sound of their laughter faded around the corner. Then, with the same calm, controlled composure that had once led men through the dark, he dipped his mop into the soapy water, wrung it out with a mechanical click, and began to erase the footprint. He was invisible, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He had nothing to prove to them. He knew the weight of the medals sitting in a velvet-lined box in his small apartment, and he knew the names of the men who weren't here to wear them. As long as the floors were clean and the trash was emptied, he was at peace. He was just the janitor, a man who didn't exist until something was broken. What the squad didn't realize, as they marched toward the mess hall with their heads held high, was that the old man they had just passed wasn't avoiding their gaze because he was ashamed. He was avoiding it because he didn't want them to see the fire that still burned in his eyes, a fire that had once scorched the earth they now walked upon. The small locker in the maintenance basement was a metal sarcophagus for a previous life. Every evening, before Eli traded the blue jumpsuit for his civilian clothes, he opened it. And for a few seconds, the scent of the base linoleum was replaced by the phantom smell of cordite, diesel, and the humid, heavy air of the jungle. Tucked behind a spare bottle of industrial degreaser sat a small, weather-worn velvet box. Inside, resting on a bed of frayed silk, was the bronze star with a combat V. It didn't glitter under the flickering basement fluorescent. It looked heavy, dark, and tired, much like the man who owned it. Beside it lay a stack of polarized photographs, their edges curled and yellowed. One showed a younger Eli, his face painted in green and black stripes, his eyes holding a terrifyingly sharp clarity as he stood among a group of men who looked more like shadows than soldiers. They were force recon. They were the ghosts of the Marine Corps, the ones sent into the places that didn't exist to do things that wouldn't be written about in history books. Eli had spent 24 years moving through the tall grass of 3 different continents, specialized in the art of being unseen. He had been a master sergeant, a man whose word was law and whose presence was a fortress for the younger Marines under his command. But the ghost life had a high price. He remembered the night in the Helmand province when the silence had been broken not by laughter, but by the scream of an incoming RPG. He remembered the weight of his radio operator, a boy no older than Private Brooks, as he carried him 3 miles through a dry creek bed while the world dissolved into fire. He remembered the way the boy's blood had felt, not like a badge of honor, but like a permanent stain that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly remove. When Eli finally retired, the silence of civilian life had been deafening. He had tried the VFW halls, but the stories there felt too loud, too performative. He had tried sitting on a porch in a quiet neighborhood, but the stillness felt like an ambush waiting to happen. He realized he didn't want a pedestal, and he certainly didn't want to be a hero in a parade. He wanted to be useful, but he wanted to be still. He had taken the job at the logistics base because it offered him a unique form of penance. By becoming the man who cleaned the floors, he could remain within the walls of the only home he had ever known, the Marine Corps, without the burden of the authority that had cost him so many brothers. The mop was a different kind of weapon. It fought the chaos, the dirt, and the entropy of a busy base. Each stroke of the mop was a prayer for the boys who didn't come home, a way to ensure that the world they had fought for stayed orderly and clean. He preferred the invisibility. Being the janitor allowed him to watch the new generation without the mask of rank. He saw their potential, their bravery, and increasingly, their dangerous lack of humility. He saw the way they wore the uniform as if the cloth itself made them invincible, forgetting that the uniform was merely a loan from those who had died wearing it. Eli ran a calloused thumb over the cool metal of the Bronze Star. He thought about the young Private Brooks, whose muddied footprint he had erased earlier that morning. He felt a flicker of the old Master Sergeant stir in his gut, a desire to drop the mop and snap the boy to attention until his knees shook. But he suppressed it. That Eli Christopher was buried in the desert. He closed the locker door with a dull metallic thud and turned the key. He didn't need the metal to know who he was, and he didn't need a salute to justify his existence. He walked back to his bucket, his gait steady and silent, a master of shadows masquerading as a servant, content to let the world believe he was nothing more than the dust he swept away. The midday sun baked the asphalt of the motor pool, sending heat ripples dancing over the hoods of the Humvees. Inside the hangar, the air was thick with the smell of grease and the sharp, rhythmic clatter of impact wrenches. Eli moved through the periphery like a shadow, his mop bucket trailing a faint scent of lemon bleach that was quickly swallowed by the fumes of JP-8 fuel. "Look at him go," Private Brooks called out, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal ceiling. He was leaned back against a stack of tires, his cover tilted at an angle that would have made a drill instructor's neck veins pop. He was tossing a heavy brass lug nut into the air and catching it, his movements filled with the loose, unearned swagger of a man who believed the world owed him an audience. "Pops is moving at a blistering half-mile per hour today. Careful there. Eli, don't want you to pull a hip." The rest of the squad, Miller, Sanchez, and the others, let out a collective bark of laughter. They were the new breed, a generation raised on digital simulations and high-speed recruitment videos, currently stationed at a logistics base where the biggest threat was boredom. To them, the Marine Corps was a brand, and they were the primary shareholders. Sergeant Ruiz, the squad leader, was nearby, half-heartedly checking a manifest. He heard the comment, but he didn't look up. He was only 24. Still young enough to want to be one of the guys, rather than the authority figure his chevrons demanded. His silence was the fuel Brooks needed. "I'm serious," Brooks continued, hopping down from the tires and swaggering toward the wet patch of floor Eli was working on. He deliberately planted a dusty boot right on the edge of the clean linoleum. "My grandfather was a Marine. He retired, bought a boat, and stayed off the grid. He didn't spend his golden years pushing a broom around a bunch of guys who actually do work. Don't you have a porch to sit on, Eli? Or did you just like the smell of floor wax that much?" Eli stopped. He didn't look up, but the mop stayed still. His hands, thick and scarred from decades of fast roping and cold weather survival, tightened around the wooden handle. For a fleeting second, the janitor mask slipped. In the set of his jaw, there was a glimpse of the man who had once commanded an entire platoon through a nightmarish ambush in the Shahikat Valley. Brooks didn't see it. He only saw a gray-haired man in a blue jumpsuit. I asked you a question, Pops. You got a tongue under that white beard? The floor is wet, Private, Eli said quietly. His voice was low, carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It wasn't an apology, it was a statement of fact. The floor is wet, Brooks mimicked in a high-pitched whine, drawing another round of snickers from the hangar. Yeah, and I'm a United States Marine. I go where I want. Maybe if you learned how to salute a real uniform, I'd respect your little wet floor signs. Sanchez chimed in from the tool bench. He probably doesn't know how to salute anymore. Brooks probably thinks a salute is something you do to a flag at a used car dealership. The arrogance in the room was a physical weight, a thick layer of pride that hadn't yet been scoured away by the reality of service. They saw the base as their kingdom and the civilians who kept it running as the background scenery. They were fast, they were loud, and they were dangerously convinced of their own importance. Eli simply turned his bucket and began to mop over the dusty print Brooks had left. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain that the real uniform was earned through blood and mud, not just issued at Paris Island. He let the mockery wash over him, watching as Brooks strutted back to his friends, high-fiving Miller as if he had just won a tactical engagement. As the squad's laughter filled the hangar, Eli looked toward the main gate, where the high-security detail was beginning to sweep the entrance for the upcoming inspection. He knew what was coming. He knew that pride always went before a fall, and that the new breed was about to learn that the most dangerous man in the room isn't always the one carrying the rifle. Sometimes, he's the one holding the mop. The atmosphere on the base shifted from casual arrogance to a frantic, jagged electricity. It was the pre-storm energy that Eli had witnessed 100 times before a high-ranking officer made planetfall. Colonel Richard Whitmore, the base commander, was a man who lived and died by the shine of his floors and the alignment of his motor pool. To Whitmore, the upcoming arrival of General Marcus Hale wasn't just an inspection, it was a performance, and the colonel was a director terrified of a bad review. Eli was in the main administrative corridor, methodically polishing the brass kickplates on the heavy oak doors, when Whitmore came charging through. The colonel was a whirlwind of starch and anxiety, flanked by 2 lieutenants who were scribbling furiously on clipboards. "I want the west gate cleared by 0900, Whitmore barked, his voice bouncing off the walls. "The motorcade will enter through the north entrance, but I want the west gate looking like a recruitment poster anyway. And the lobby. If I see a single smudge on that glass, I'm holding someone's career over a flame." Whitmore stopped abruptly, his polished boots skidding slightly on the linoleum Eli had just buffed. He looked down, not at Eli's face, but at the blue jumpsuit, his eyes trailing up only far enough to see the maintenance patch on the chest. To the colonel, Eli was simply a human-shaped piece of base equipment, a mobile cleaning unit that happened to breathe. "You," Whitmore said, pointing a gloved finger toward the bucket. "Make sure you're out of this hallway by 1000. General Hale doesn't need to be stepping over mops. Take your gear down to the sub-basement or the loading docks. Just stay out of the line of sight." "Understood, Colonel," Eli said. He kept his voice neutral, the tone of a man who had mastered the art of being part of the scenery. He didn't offer a salute, civilians weren't required to, and Eli knew that showing his old military bearing now would only complicate the mask he had spent years perfecting. Whitmore didn't even wait for the acknowledgement. He turned back to his lieutenants, already on to the next crisis. "Does the general have his briefing on the new logistics software? And for God's sake, make sure the young ones, Brooks and his squad, are standing tall. I want Hale to see the future of the Corps, not a bunch of slack-jawed kids." Eli watched them go, his rags slowing against the brass. He knew Richard Whitmore. He had known men like him for 40 years. Officers who were so focused on the polish that they forgot to check the structural integrity of the men beneath them. Whitmore saw the new breed as a reflection of his own leadership, a bright, shiny future he could present to the general. He saw Eli as a relic, a piece of furniture that had outlived its aesthetic value. The irony wasn't lost on Eli. He knew General Marcus Hale. He remembered a younger, thinner Marcus Hale, a captain who had once huddled in a freezing trench in the Hindu Kush, sharing a tin of lukewarm rations with a master sergeant named Christopher. He remembered the way Hale's hands had shaken during his first real fireback, and how Eli had put a steadying hand on his shoulder and told him to breathe. But that was a different lifetime, and Hale was a 4-star general now. Eli had no intention of interrupting the general's busy schedule with a trip down memory lane. He was content to be the background furniture Whitmore wanted him to be. As the base sirens gave a short, sharp burst, the signal that the motorcade was 10 miles out, Eli gathered his supplies. He moved with a quiet, deliberate pace, ignoring the frantic running of younger Marines around him. He retreated toward the shadows of the side corridors, a ghost pulling back into the mist. He would follow orders. He would stay out of the line of sight. But as he looked at the frantic, unearned pride in the eyes of the young Marines lining up for the parade, he felt a familiar, cold weight in his stomach. The polish was there, but the foundation was brittle. And he knew, better than anyone, that a general like Hale had a way of seeing right through the shine. The hallway leading to the west loading docks was a narrow artery of beige paint and industrial lighting, usually deserted during high-level inspections. Eli moved through it with the practiced silence of a man who had spent half his life avoiding thermal imaging and tripwires. He had his bucket, his mop, and his orders to stay out of sight. But as he rounded the corner near the secondary equipment lockers, he found the path blocked. Private Brooks and his squad were there, tucked away in the alcove, supposedly on security detail, but clearly using the isolation to slack off before the general reached their sector. When they saw Eli, the boredom on Brooks's face curdled into a sharp, predatory grin. "Well, look who it is," Brooks said, pushing off the wall. He stepped into the center of the linoleum. His chest puffed out, flanked by Miller and Sanchez. "Colonel said to clear the decks, Pops. That means trash like this shouldn't be clogging up the arteries of a tactical environment." Eli stopped 10 feet back. He didn't drop his gaze. "I'm heading to the loading docks." "Private, step aside." The squad didn't move. Instead, they fanned out, creating a semicircle that pinned Eli against the lockers. It was a classic flanking maneuver, executed with the clumsy bravado of boys who had only ever seen it done in training manuals. Brooks leaned in close, the smell of cheap peppermint gum and unearned confidence radiating off him. He reached out and flicked the collar of Eli's blue jumpsuit with a look of pure disgust. "Look at this fabric," Brooks sneered, his voice dropping to a low, mocking hiss. "Polyester. Blue. A name tag that says maintenance instead of United States Marine. You're a stain on this base, Eli. You walk around here like you belong, but you're just a janitor. You're a servant. My boots have more history in their tread than you have in your entire civilian life. You shouldn't be in this hallway, Brooks," Eli said quietly. His voice was a low hum, steady as a heartbeat. "The general is on base. You should be at your post." "I am at my post," Brooks snapped, his face reddening. "My post is wherever I say it is. And right now, I'm wondering why a man in a janitor's suit thinks he can talk back to a Marine. You see these? These are private first-class stripes. They mean I'm part of the spear. You're the dirt the spear wipes off after a fight." Miller laughed, a jagged, nervous sound. "Maybe he wants to salute you, Brooks. Maybe he's just waiting for the right moment to show some respect to the working class." Brooks stepped even closer, his athletic frame towering over Eli's slightly bent shoulders. He pointed a finger at the center of Eli's chest. "That's it. I want it. Right now. I'm tired of you looking at us like you're better than us. Salute me, janitor. Salute the uniform you aren't fit to wear." Eli stood perfectly still. His posture was straight, not with the rigid fear of a subordinate, but with the controlled composure of a mountain. He looked at Brooks, really looked at him, seeing past the bravado and into the hollow insecurity of a boy who needed a rank to feel like a man. "I don't think you want that." "Son," Eli said. The word son wasn't an endearment, it was a clinical assessment. "Don't call me son," Brooks growled, his hand moving as if to shove Eli's shoulder. "I'm a Marine. You're the guy who cleans the toilets I use. You're nothing but background noise. You're a ghost. And if you don't show some proper military courtesy in the next 5 seconds, I'm going to make sure your bucket is the only thing left of you in this hallway." The air in the corridor grew heavy, thick with the overconfident energy of the squad. They were leaning forward, 5 young men in camouflage against one old man in blue. They were laughing, pointing, and taunting, convinced they were the apex predators in this concrete jungle. They didn't hear the distant, heavy thud of a vehicle door closing. They didn't see the red and blue lights beginning to reflect off the glass at the far end of the hall. They only saw a target. Eli didn't flinch. He gripped his wooden mop handle, his eyes steady and unimpressed, waiting for the world to catch up to the mistake these boys were making. He had nothing to prove, but he knew the silence of the hallway was about to be broken by a sound they would never forget. The pressure in the hallway was physical, a thick, suffocating layer of arrogance that Private Brooks and his squad wore like armor. Brooks was inches away now, his breath smelling of the base mess hall and the sharp, acidic tang of adrenaline. He was waiting for the janitor to blink, to tremble, or to offer the stuttered apology they had come to expect from the civilian staff. But Eli Christopher didn't move. He stood with his weight centered, his boots, worn but clean, planted firmly on the linoleum. To the young Marines, he looked like an old man frozen by fear. They didn't have the experience to recognize the unmoving mountain for what it really was, a predator's stillness. Eli wasn't looking at Brooks's stripes or his polished brass. He was looking through him, his steady eyes tracking the micro-movements of the boy's shoulders and the tension in his jaw. Tick-tock, pops, Miller jeered from the flank, tapping his watch. The clock is running out on your career. Just a little snap of the hand to the brow. It's not that hard. Even a janitor can remember how to bend an elbow. Maybe he's rusted shut, Sanchez added, leaning in to join the circle. Like the rest of this dinosaur base. You hear me? Old man. We're the ones holding the line now. You're just the guy who mops up the leaks. The mockery reached a crescendo, a jagged wall of noise designed to break a man's spirit. Brooks, emboldened by the laughter, reached out and shoved Eli's shoulder. Not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to test the boundaries. Eli's body absorbed the impact without swaying. His expression didn't change. It was a controlled composure that had been forged in places these boys only saw in movies. Places where the noise was louder than laughter and the stakes were measured in lives. Not ego. He had stood before warlords and stared down the barrel of rifles without flinching. The taunts of a 19-year-old were nothing more than the rustle of dry leaves. You think you're invisible, Brooks hissed, his face contorting with a sudden, sharp anger at Eli's silence. You think you can just ignore us because you've been here forever? You're nothing. You're a ghost in a blue suit, and I'm tired of looking at you. Brooks raised his hand again, his fingers curling into a fist. The overconfident energy of the squad peaking as they waited for the humiliation to turn physical. The hallway seemed to shrink. The fluorescent lights humming with an electric tension that felt like a fuse burning toward a powder keg. I've seen your type before, Brooks, Eli said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the squad's laughter like a combat knife through silk. It was a voice of gravel and command, carrying a weight that momentarily staggered the boys. You think the uniform is a shield. You think it makes you bigger than the man next to you. But the uniform is just cloth. It's what's inside it that matters, and right now, I don't see much of anything inside yours. The silence that followed was absolute. Brooks's face went from red to a ghostly white, his fist trembling midair. He looked into Eli's eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see a janitor. He saw a depth of experience that was terrifying, a cold, clinical gaze that appraised him and found him wanting. For a heartbeat, the power dynamic in the hallway flipped. The janitor was no longer a target. He was the authority. And the Marines were the ones standing on shaky ground. The air grew cold, the frozen moment of tension stretching until it felt ready to snap. At the far end of the corridor, the heavy double doors began to hiss open. The reflection of red and blue emergency lights intensified, bouncing off the polished floorboards Eli had worked so hard to maintain. The heavy, rhythmic thud of several pairs of high-gloss boots echoed down the hall, a sound of absolute, unquestionable power. Eli didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on Brooks, his posture straight and his grip on the mop handle as steady as a rifle. The world is about to get very small for you, Private, he whispered. Then, the first of the general's security detail rounded the corner, and the mountain waited for the storm to break. The heavy double doors at the end of the corridor didn't just open. They were thrown wide by two MPs in full tactical gear, their movements sharp, synchronized, and loud. The clinical silence of the hallway was shattered by the low, guttural thrum of a high-security motorcade idling just outside the entrance. As the armored SUV pulled into the internal bay, its red and blue emergency lights caught the polished surfaces of the walls, strobing across the scene like a rhythmic pulse. The flashes framed Eli in a surreal, alternating glow, red then blue then shadow. He remained perfectly still. The wooden mop handle held at his side with the casual ease of a staff. The strobe lights played across his face, highlighting the deep-set lines of his jaw and the unwavering iron in his eyes. To Brooks and his squad, the sudden intrusion of the general's arrival was a panic-inducing siren. To Eli, It was simply the environment returning to a state he recognized. Snap to. Snap to. SGT. Ruiz hissed, his voice cracking as he scrambled to pull his squad into a line. The young Marines bolted into a frantic, sloppy version of attention. Brooks, his face still pale from the words Eli had just leveled at him, stood rigid, his eyes locked straight ahead. Though they flickered with terror every time the red light swept over the janitor he had been mocking seconds before. They were a row of camouflage and trembling knees, desperately trying to mask their insubordination with the sudden appearance of discipline. The rear door of the armored vehicle opened. A pair of high-gloss jump boots hit the linoleum with a sound like a gavel. General Marcus Hale stepped into the strobe-lit hallway. He was a pillar of salt and pepper hair and rows of ribbons that told the story of 40 years of American conflict. Beside him, Colonel Whitmore scurried like a nervous shadow, his face a mask of performative excellence. As you can see, General, we maintain the highest standards of readiness in every sector, Whitmore was saying, his voice projecting a confidence his darting eyes betrayed. Even in the secondary corridors, my men are. Whitmore stopped mid-sentence. His eyes landed on the squad, then shifted with a look of pure venom to the man in the blue jumpsuit standing in their midst. Christopher, Whitmore barked, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed purple. I told you to clear this area. What are you doing obstructing the general's path? Move that bucket and get to the loading docks, now. Brooks felt a surge of malicious relief. He expected the general to look at Eli with the same disgusted dismissal the colonel had shown, to see nothing but a janitor who had failed to follow a simple order. But General Hale didn't look at the squad. He didn't even look at Whitmore. The general's gaze had locked onto Eli the moment he stepped out of the car. He stopped 10 feet away, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp recognition that bypassed the blue jumpsuit, the gray hair, and the mop. He saw the unmoving mountain he had relied on when the world was falling apart in the mountains of Afghanistan. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the armored engine. The red and blue lights continued to sweep over them, painting the general's medals and Eli's weathered face in the colors of the flag they both served. Whitmore opened his mouth to shout again, to demand Eli's removal. But the words died in his throat as he saw the expression on the general's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was a profound, bone-deep respect that bordered on reverence. Eli didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood in the light, his steady eyes meeting the general's. In that moment, the hallway ceased to be a corridor in a logistics base. It became a bridge between the present and a shared blood-stained past. The young Marines stood frozen, their breath catching in their chests as they realized the air in the room had suddenly changed, and the man they had called nothing was the only one the general was looking at. The strobing red and blue lights seemed to pulse in time with the frantic heartbeats of the 5 young Marines. Colonel Whitmore had already taken a step forward, his hand outstretched to physically shove Eli out of the way, his mouth opening to deliver a final, career-ending reprimand to the insubordinate janitor. General, I deeply apologize for this eyesore, Whitmore began, his voice tight with sycophantic urgency. He was ordered to silence. The word wasn't shouted. It was a low, vibratory command that acted like a physical blow. Colonel Whitmore didn't just stop talking. He seemed to deflate, his hand freezing in midair. General Marcus Hale didn't spare the colonel a glance. His boots, polished to a mirror sheen, clicked against the linoleum as he walked past the trembling squad. He stopped exactly 30 inches in front of Eli Christopher. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the hallway was the distant hum of the idling motorcade and the ragged, shallow breathing of Private Brooks. Brooks watched from the corner of his eye, his mind reeling. He expected the general to dress the old man down. He expected a lecture on protocol. He waited for the moment the janitor would be cast out of the building. Instead, General Hale's posture underwent a transformation. The slight, weary slump of a man burdened by 4 stars and a decade of bureaucracy vanished. His spine became a rod of iron. His chin lifted. Then, with a sharpness that echoed like a rifle shot against the concrete walls, the general snapped his right hand to the brow of his cover. He was standing at a rigid, textbook attention, and he was saluting the man in the blue jumpsuit. The hallway went tomb silent. Sergeant Ruiz's jaw literally dropped. Brooks felt the world tilt on its axis. A 4-star general was rendering honors to a man holding a mop. It was a subversion of the natural order, so profound it felt like the walls themselves might crumble. "Master Sergeant," Hale said, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion that he didn't bother to hide. "I thought we lost you in the Tora Bora extraction. They told me you'd gone to ground." Eli didn't immediately move. He looked at the hand at the general's brow, then slowly, deliberately, he leaned his mop against the locker. He stood up straight. The slight stoop he had cultivated for years, the janitor's hunch, evaporated. His shoulders squared, and his chest filled out, transforming the simple blue fabric of his jumpsuit into something that looked, for a fleeting moment, like dress blues. Eli didn't salute back. As a civilian, he didn't have to. But he nodded a slow, solemn acknowledgement of a bond forged in blood and frozen trenches. "I didn't go to ground, Marcus," Eli said, his voice no longer the quiet hum of a servant, but the gravelly resonance of a leader. "I just went to work. Some of us still have to keep the floors clean while you're busy winning wars on television." A ghost of a smile touched the general's lips, though his hand stayed locked at his brow. "You're the only man alive who would dare call a 4-star general by his first name while holding a bucket of bleach." Hale finally lowered his hand, but he didn't relax his stance. He turned his head slightly, his eyes cutting like a bayonet toward Private Brooks and the rest of the squad. The stern disapproval in his gaze was cold enough to frost the glass of the lockers. "Colonel Whitmore," the general said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, clinical tone, "does your staff always treat the recipient of the Navy Cross and 3 Purple Hearts as background furniture?" Whitmore turned a shade of gray that matched the floor. The Navy Cross, sir?" The general stepped closer to Brooks, who looked as if he might faint. "This man was force recon when you were still in diapers, Private. He has forgotten more about being a Marine than you will ever learn in your entire miserable career. If I ever hear of a single member of this command showing Master Sergeant Christopher anything less than the reverence due a living legend, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your enlistment peeling potatoes in a galley in the Aleutian Islands." Brooks couldn't speak. He couldn't even blink. He looked at Eli, really looked at him, and finally saw the scars on the hands, the iron in the eyes, and the quiet dignity of a warrior who didn't need a salute to be a king. The janitor was gone. In his place stood the shadow of a giant. Eli simply picked up his mop. "Easy on them, Marcus. They're just young. They think the shine is the thing. They haven't learned yet that the shine eventually wears off. It's the steel underneath that holds the weight." General Hale nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Eli's. "Then perhaps it's time we showed them what the steel looks like." The aftermath of the inspection didn't result in a flurry of paperwork or a public ceremony. In the Marine Corps, the most profound changes usually happen in the quiet spaces between the noise. By the following Monday, the blue jumpsuit was gone, replaced not by the dress blues of Eli's past, but by a crisp set of khaki utilities and a contractor's badge that read Senior Tactical Consultant. Eli no longer carried a mop. He carried a clipboard and 40 years of hard-won wisdom. The loading dock hallway, once the site of Eli's humiliation, was now the site of his first unofficial classroom. He stood at the head of the corridor, his back against the lockers, watching as Brooks's squad approached. They didn't swagger this time. Their boots hit the floor with a tentative, respectful rhythm. When they reached the spot where the bucket used to sit, the entire squad stopped. Private Brooks was at the front. He looked as if he hadn't slept since the general's visit. His uniform was perfect, not for a show, but out of a desperate, newfound necessity to be worthy of the space he occupied. He looked at Eli, and for the first time, he didn't see an old man or a janitor. He saw a bridge to a legacy he had nearly disrespected out of existence. Without a word from SGT Ruiz, Brooks snapped to attention. The rest of the squad followed suit, a wave of stiffening spines and tucked chins. "Master Sergeant," Brooks said, his voice cracking slightly before he steadied it. "Requesting permission to speak, sir." Eli let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. He wasn't interested in their fear. He was interested in their growth. "I'm a civilian contractor now, Brooks. You don't need to sir me. And you certainly don't need to salute the clothes I'm wearing." Brooks shook his head, his eyes fixed on a point just above Eli's shoulder. "It's not the clothes, Master Sergeant. We didn't know. We were out of line. I was out of line. I thought I knew what a Marine looked like. I thought it was about who yelled the loudest." Eli stepped forward, closing the distance until he was standing exactly where Brooks had stood during the standoff. He reached out and adjusted the tilt of Brooks's cover, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle. Respect isn't a rank, son, Eli said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that filled the hallway. And it isn't something you demand because you signed a contract and put on a set of camis. Respect is a currency. You earn it in the mud. You earn it in the way you treat the people who can do nothing for you. And you earn it by being the man who stays calm when everyone else is screaming. He looked at each of them in turn, Miller, Sanchez, Ruiz. You saw a janitor and thought you saw someone beneath you. But in a combat zone, the man who ensures your water is clean and your gear is staged is just as vital as the man on the trigger. If you can't respect the servant, you have no business being the master. Brooks nodded, a single sharp movement. We want to learn, sir. The general said. He said you were the steel underneath. Eli looked down at his hands, the scars, the calluses, the history written in skin. He looked at the floor he had spent years scrubbing, now reflecting the morning sun. He realized that by hiding, he had denied these boys the very thing they needed most. A map of the territory he had already crossed. The bridge program starts tomorrow at 0500, Eli said, turning to walk toward the administration wing. Bring your rucks. Bring your manuals. And leave your egos in the barracks. We're going to find out if there's any steel in you, or if you're just a layer of polish. As he walked away, he heard the sharp, synchronized snap of 5 hands hitting 5 brows. He didn't turn around to see the salute. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the air, the sound of a legacy being reclaimed. Eli Christopher was no longer a ghost or a janitor. He was a Marine, and he was finally home.